Kia ora, my name is Amy, and today I am hoping to ignite a bit of a fire in each of you before teaching you some tools that you can use to critique media reports that talk about research. This is the missing data, and today we are advocating for women through statistical literacy. Let's start off with something that most of us do on a pretty regular basis. When we jump in our cars, we should be putting on our seatbelts. But did you know that women are 71% more likely to be moderately injured in a car accident than men? We are also almost 50% to be seriously injured and almost 20% more likely to die in a car accident compared to our male counterparts. These statistics control for, that is, they make comparisons fairer by considering the driver's height, weight, seatbelt use, and crash intensity. This is due to a few things. For starters, women tend to sit further forwards in a vehicle when driving and also in a more upright position. This, along with our physiology, means that we sit with our knees and our hips at a more dangerous angle. We also typically have fewer and weaker muscles in our necks and upper torsos. In an accident, it is also more likely that women's body is thrown faster than men's, as seat cushioning does not absorb enough of the force for what a typical woman's body needs. Additional to this, cars and seatbelts are definitely not designed to accommodate pregnant women. Seatbelts rarely fit over heavily pregnant women properly. So why are seatbelts something that is meant to save lives, not better designed for women? Well, it's because we are not part of the data that determines the safety of cars. Since the 1950s, crash dummies have been used to test how safe a car is in a crash. But the crash dummy is modeled on a typical man, with male-based muscle mass, a height just under 1.8 meters, and around 76 kgs in weight. This means that our physiological differences are not taken into account. In fact, those tests that do require a female test dummy, and there aren't many that require compulsory testing of females in these crash tests. The female test dummy is actually just a smaller version of the usual test dummy. In the EU, only 1 of 5 tests require that a female test dummy is used. And even then, they don't have to be put in the driver's seat. Something less serious, but maybe more bothersome. And I will pause here just to mention that you'll notice I flip-flop between something serious and something more lighthearted in these examples. We'll try and balance it out. How many of you have argued with a male over the temperature of the heat pump? This is something me and my partner argue about all the time. Turns out we tend to have a lower metabolic rate than men. So we typically use less energy than men when performing the same task. Heat is a byproduct of the metabolic process, so some women will feel colder than men when performing similar tasks. This might not apply to everybody, but it is a common problem in our offices. Back in the 1960s, when companies first started using a specific formula to determine an optimal office temperature, there were basically oodles of men in the office and not very many women. This meant that their formula worked out great for the men. Times have changed though, and there are more women in office spaces now compared to back in the 1960s. But the formula and the temperature haven't changed. So on average, offices are about 5 degrees Celsius too cold for women. Back to a serious one, we're talking about PPE, or personal protective equipment, which is meant to keep the user safe. Just like our not so trusty seatbelts though, PPE is designed around the body proportions of men. Just like our female crash dummies being a smaller version of the male crash dummies, it seems that people think that women are just scaled down versions of men, so smaller PPE would work just as well. It doesn't take into account our differences in physiology, and often that will mean that our PPE doesn't fit properly. And there's a rather upsetting example of this in 1997, where a British female police officer was killed after removing her ill-fitting body armor. She was trying to ram down a door, but was finding that her PPE was getting in the way. So she took it off to be able to better use the ramming thing. And as a consequence, she was not protected by the PPE when she was fatally stabbed. Back to a less serious one, but definitely an annoying one. If you've ever been to an event and seen the queue for the female toilets, this is again because we are missing in the data. Here's the deal with loo queues. In terms of fairness, when they start looking at floor space, they decided it was better, I mean men, decided it would be optimal to split the bathroom area equally. Seems fair, but because men can do that fancy thing where they stand up when they pee, they can fit more men in that floor space. They can fit more urinals and cubicles than what we would be able to do in female bathrooms where we require just stalls. Additionally to this, women can take up to 2.3 times longer than men. So if a man takes 30 seconds, a woman could take up to 1:10. Some of this is due to our higher proportions of elderly, of women with disabilities, and of females accompanying children to bathrooms, all of which could lead to longer waiting times. We also need additional time to change sanitary products, something that men don't have to deal with. Equal area, but not equal opportunity to pee. Okay, question for you. What was the best model of iPhone? Pretty sure it was the iPhone 7, and I'm sure a lot of you would agree. I currently have an iPhone XR, and it's just not as good. It doesn't fit in my hand as well as the other did. The 7 was way better. Smartphones are typically too big for females. Female hands are typically smaller than men's, so we have greater difficulty using our smartphones. Now, this is also a good time to point out that I have specifically been using terms such as typically, on average, and tends to, as some of these examples won't resonate with everyone. For example, I actually have unreasonably large hands. I managed to emasculate even NBA players with phone. So phone size doesn't actually resonate with me all that much. I still think the 7 is the better, smaller, more optimal size, but I am less challenged by reaching across my phone because my hands are bigger than a lot of men's. So if some of these examples don't resonate with you, hopefully some of them do. Not all of them will. For example, while iPhone size isn't too much of a problem for me, I do have a problem with bloody Siri. Speech recognition software was trained mostly on male speech patterns, so are less likely to recognize female voices, leading to us shouting at our damn phones much more often than men. Okay, now you might have CPR training or have at least got some sort of mental image of what a CPR dummy looks like. If not, pause the video here and go and take a look. What does a CPR dummy look like? And when you're having a look at it, what do you notice about it being different to women? That's right, CPR is learnt on male dummies, and I don't think I've ever heard of female dummies being used at all. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a difference between men and women when it comes to receiving CPR. And it turns out that people are generally less comfortable and less familiar with performing CPR on women. So we are almost 25% less likely to receive CPR in public. Note, though, that this is not so much the case when it comes to receiving CPR at home. Certainly does when it comes to strangers, as there's a bit of a barrier, shall we say. Now, Viagra. This is a somewhat well-known story these days. Viagra, you know, the little blue pill that some men need on a Friday night after a romantic candlelit dinner. This was originally produced as a blood pressure medication. Back then, it was called sildenafil, and it was created in the UK by Pfizer. They noticed it could make them a rather lot of money if they used it for something other than blood pressure. There's a rather hilarious and educational documentary on 3Now about Viagra, which suggests that in the early 1990s, when sildenafil was being tested as a blood pressure medication, initial studies often only involved male volunteers. Note that they weren't testing for Viagra yet. They were testing blood pressure medication on a group of only male volunteers. Where were the women in this study? We need blood pressure medication too. But no, it was only on males. Viagra itself, though, there is no female equivalent. The men accidentally ended up with one through blood pressure medication that only they were testing. And there's still no female equivalent of Viagra. Yeah. In fact, medical diagnoses in general are typically based around men. One example that I've come across also on 3Now, there's a rather good rather good documentary on autism. And it's presented by this lady here, Christine McGuinness, and she's an English model with an ASD, autism spectrum disorder. She presented a view into how women experience autism. It turns out ASD is 4 times more common in boys, but some of this might be due to how ASD presents in females compared to males. The tests for ASD are designed around the symptoms presented by males, often young boys. A common one, often young boys with ASD will really initiate trains. In women, it's thought that actually this might be horses instead. For women, ASD might be unknown even until adulthood. In terms of masking, so that's covering up being neurodivergent, women are considerably better at this anyway, so the traditional tests often don't work for us. Case in point, lovely Christine was a beauty queen, which I think for most people's perception of autism, this would be a very unlikely career choice for someone with ASD traits. Are you feeling like something is wrong with this picture? These are just some examples of cases where women were overlooked in research, in data. Car safety, office temperatures, PPE, autism. Why are women not important enough to be of concern? Now, it's not just women, it's a whole bunch of people. And that's because typically data and research is based on this guy, the reference man. He's a male Caucasian in his late 20s. He's 1.77 meters tall and usually weighs between 70 to 80 kgs. So that means if you are a woman, African American, Maori, Asian, younger, older, shorter, taller, lighter, heavier, chances are the data doesn't represent you. And that's really what my talk is all about today. This is about representation. And the fact is that our data often isn't collected. First, we have to be able to identify that the research is not applicable to us. And then we can start asking why not and start being a little more vocal about it. Hopefully, some of those prior examples were a bit of a surprise to you, or perhaps you had experienced them but weren't too sure why. Now you know why, and I hope that there's a little bit of a fire there of, well, hey, why aren't we included in this data? So towards equity, I'm hoping that what we'll cover next, we'll look at how we can start to critique media reports talking about research and try and identify whether it is representing us. We're going to have a look at 7 components. These are all translated from Jessica Utz's work on statistical literacy. So I've adapted some of the language used, some of the wording and the approaches just for usability in our everyday settings. These 7 components are tools. They are questions to ask in order to determine whether research presented in the media is applicable to us, whether it's trustworthy and valid. Let's start with the stakeholders. Here we are talking about who. And for a lot of these, actually, we could probably simplify it further and say that we're just talking about the 5 W's plus H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. In this case, we're talking about who initiated the research, who funded the research, and who carried out the research. What we're looking for is potential for bias and whether any of these parties have an agenda. Is there a result that will be particularly profitable for them? What is their aim? So, for example, there is a fair amount of research funded by tobacco companies into cures for cancer. Why? Because if tobacco companies had a cure for cancer, smoking is no longer a problem. It's very profitable for them. We might be a little suspicious if there was some new research that came out that said it's okay, we can carry on smoking, lung cancer is cured, and it was funded by the tobacco companies. Likewise, if there were survey results talking about, I don't know, Whittaker's being New Zealand's favourite kind of chocolate, and it was conducted by Whittaker's, we might be a little bit dubious as to what's actually going on with those results. Next, we're looking at the study itself and where the information comes from. Who is sampled, and importantly, are they like you? We're looking for representation here. For example, Americans will have a different opinion as to whether Whittaker's is better than Hershey's than New Zealanders would. Likewise, lizard people are unlikely to have the same political opinions as you. We can see this actually a lot in the American political polls. So if you think back to when Trump was up against Hillary Clinton, both teams said, we're going to win this election. Look at our data. And it turned out that they had got it from 2 different places. One of them were doing phone calls to house line numbers, and the other were looking at social media polls. When you compare the 2, you've got very different demographics contributing to each of these polls. We also want to be concerned about how the study design could impact the conditions that the participants were studied under. In particular, did they have to remember something that happened a very, very long time ago? Was there an overly long, arduous survey they had to write? By the end of it, they were very bored or tired or fed up. And were they bribed into providing a positive opinion? How the sample is selected is essentially like, are they volunteers? Volunteers and non-volunteers could have quite differing opinions on a topic. Who doesn't volunteer compared to who does? And often this will be down to whether or not someone is interested in the topic being studied and therefore has an opinion on that. In research, we often hope for a random sample, but often this is quite difficult to do. So we just want to question, who doesn't this sample include? Assessment. We should be curious about what measurements were actually taken so we can make good comparisons. We don't want to be comparing apples to oranges, but we also don't want to be accepting factoids regarding subpar measurements. For example, BMI is notoriously bad at being a measure for physical fitness. Case in point, rugby players are often counted as being obese due to their weight compared to their height, but in actuality, they're some of the fittest people out there. Even deeper than that, we want to know exactly how the measurements were defined. Now, there's an example in Tim Harford's Data Detective book that looked at the mortality rates of newborns at a hospital in London compared to one in Wales. And the researchers who conducted this found a stark difference, only for the researchers to then realize that the two hospitals had defined newborn quite differently. Some of them had said only for a few days compared to a few weeks, for example. Question wording can also be quite dangerous, as researchers will sometimes craft questionnaires to elicit certain answers that they would like. It's pretty easy, for example, to manipulate somebody into answering yes to the key question if they had said yes to everything before. For example, do you like chocolate? Yes. Do you like pizza? Also yes. Well, you must like chocolate on pizza. And then you kind of feel silly if you put no. But of course, who likes chocolate on pizza? Environment. Now, I know I don't need to tell you that New Zealand is a pretty special place, so we want to be conscious of where the research took place. If it isn't New Zealand, is it a comparable country? And what are the potential differences that could impact the results? Can these insights actually be extended to here? Likewise, the 1920s was a much different lifestyle to the 2020s. We need to ask when the research was implemented and what the environment was like during that time period, even today compared to a few years ago. Think war, illness, COVID-19, economy, politics, social norms. The more specific aspects of the environment that research was conducted in is also important to consider. So here we are talking about how the environment was looking. Now, interrogation, probably quite unlikely these days, but there are definitely going to be differences in the studies conducted online compared to in person, with an interviewer or without an interviewer, in a cold clinic versus a warm office. These can all impact our results. There will have been biases relating to the topics covered so far, but I really want to mention three in particular. Non-response bias is where someone is invited to reply, but choose not to. Self-selection is where only certain people volunteer. And selection bias is where those who you sample are from a subset that don't represent the target population. So an example, suppose you want to know what Gisborne's favorite book is. You send out a poll on Facebook to all of your friends, but only half reply. You don't even hear from the other half. This is non-response. People were invited, but they ignored you. So instead you go and put a QR code up around town for people to submit what their favorite book is. This is self-selection. This is volunteers taking their time to submit the form. They have to put their hand up to participate. As a last-ditch effort, you ask everyone who comes into Paper Plus on a specific day. This is selection bias. We're talking about a single day at a single shop. People who shop at Paper Plus compared to those who order their books online could have quite different opinions on what their favorite book is. Now we get into the actual statistics, and this can be a little bit more tricky because researchers often don't translate what they're actually meaning in their results. We want to know what statistics are quoted. Is it a mean, a median, a rate? What does it then translate to? So if a researcher says something increased by 150%, if it was initially $1, that means it's now $1.50. And if we're talking about, shocking price increases, maybe that's not as much of a concern as if it started off at $100 and is now $150. Sometimes they also won't tell us what that base value is, so it can be difficult to know what they're comparing to. We also want to know how believable these values are. If they took another sample, do you think we could get quite different results? We're looking for a significant difference, something that has an impact. Now, for the most part, any statistics will have a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of flex. So some indication of what this flex is usually a pretty good idea. For example, if I suggest that the average height of New Zealanders is exactly 170 centimeters, most people are going to say, no, I'm not that average height. If instead I said it was somewhere between 162 centimeters to 176 centimeters, I'm going to have a little bit more better ability to capture that average. There'll be more people who go, oh yeah, I'm average height. Using exact numbers is often not a good idea. We prefer having a little bit of wiggle room in there as a measure of uncertainty. We also want to check in with what makes sense. Be curious and question what's been excluded. What else would you want to know? Is the information complete? Fake news is particularly prevalent these days as well, so much so that even US government officials have been caught quoting false statistics. So who actually published this, and are they reputable? Is it just simply someone's opinion? And lastly, is it consistent with your prior knowledge? Based on what you know about the world, about science, your lived experiences, does this make sense? And if the answer is no, why not? Why might your experience be different compared to what is published in a study? We want to ask, is this relevant to me? And if you take away anything to critique media reports talking about studies, it's this. Is it relevant to me? Too often, we see statements that appear to address everyone, but looking into it further, it might only apply to Americans or teenagers or men. If it isn't relevant to you, find something that is. And if it isn't there, if you can't find any, ask why not. Where is it? Maybe you can fill in the gap or shout about it. Ask for that gap to be filled. If you'd like to look into some of those references further, they are now on the screen. Feel free to pause. Otherwise, this has been The Missing Data. We've been advocating for women through statistical literacy. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you again soon.